Okay, so this video is just to help you go through this PowerPoint, which you should have access to as well. So this is section 5 of the disease dilemmas topic. We're now into a section about whether or not diseases can be eradicated. There are some examples of diseases that have been eradicated and some where we've tried and failed. This lesson particularly is about using natural medicines to treat illness. So we need to know a few examples of medicines from nature, and then we've got a specific example, which is the Rosy Periwinkle. And so we need to understand the sustainability issues that are around it, overuse of them, and all this kind of thing. So in the video, we'll come up to activities that are in the PowerPoint, and I'll just explain those, and then you can pause the video and do the activity and then carry on, things like that. So first of all, have a think about what you already know about medicines from nature. Do you know any examples of medicines that come from nature and that kind of thing? So we go back to 450 BC and Hippocrates, who was a Greek physician, documented a huge number of diseases, medicines even from nature, so over 300. So Hippocrates is where we get the Hippocratic Oath, which is what doctors take when they start medicine. It's the kind of oath that says that they'll do no harm and they'll always look after their patients and things like this. So he was very important in terms of history of medicine. We also have the Society of Apothecaries, which was in the mid-16th century. So these were sorts of chemists who were looking at different drugs that could help treat medicines. And we discovered things like alkaloids and glycosides in the 19th century, which were, again, important in the formation of medicine. Though, obviously, going back through this, people have had knowledge of medicine for thousands of years. It's just not necessarily been understood in a sort of scientific manner. So we have examples here, sorts of people, various anecdotal and scientific evidence of cannabis being used in different ways to treat illnesses. Bottom right here, we've got opium from a poppy. So that would be the basis for both heroin and morphine. So what you tend to find is that there's sort of the correct use of a lot of medicines, and then there's arguably like abuse of those medicines, so overuse or use without doctors' prescriptions. So an awful lot of the things that we use as a medicine, if you took too much of, could potentially kill you or cause you severe harm. So for example, something like aspirin is designed to thin the blood, and that's used to kind of relieve pain, but then if you took far too much of it, then that would ultimately thin the blood to a point where you would die. So that's kind of the basis of most medicine, is using something somewhat toxic but in a small enough amount that it doesn't kill you and it kind of helps alleviate a problem. So we've got a few examples of natural medicines. So as I mentioned, we've got opium from a poppy, and we've got here willow. So willow is the origin of aspirin. The bark was chewed by people and it provides pain relief. And we've got here a couple of points about where these are found. So the specification specifically mentions that it wants you to know the growing conditions and the medical uses of these, which seems a little bit random. But with this topic, you do get 6-mark questions in the exam, and that's exactly where you could just be asked to kind of give a little bit of information about a natural medicine, and potentially asked to kind of talk about the growing conditions potentially, because it is mentioned in the specification. They can ask you about it directly, so it's just worth knowing. These are foxgloves, so these are very dangerous. If you sort of were to come into contact with them and have too much of them, then they could kill you, but then in medicine they can be used to cure heart failure. So as I mentioned, we need to know a little bit about these different natural medicines. On page 359 of the textbook, there's a table with a whole range of them. So if you just pick 3 from that table, I think that should be plenty, and take notes on where we get that drug from, the growing conditions, the medical usage. I would recommend choosing some that are easy to remember. So we've got things like morphine and nicotine, caffeine, the foxglove from Digitalis. Yeah, I wouldn't pick ones that you've never heard of before that are going to be really difficult to kind of remember in an exam, okay? So this is the example that we're using as our sort of mini case study, significant example of a natural medicine. So this is the Rosy Periwinkle. So this comes from Madagascar, and we've got a few bits there about growing conditions. So it's been known about for a long time by herbalists and sort of people who do medicine in Madagascar. Used to treat a whole load of things, so pain and circulatory issues and intestinal issues and things like this, and then historically used in France in various potions and things like this. This is a slide with a video in, so once you finish watching this, you can watch this other video, which is in the PowerPoint. It's about 8 minutes long. It's got some really good information about different medicinal plants. It's a good way to get a few extra notes, okay? So back to the Rosy Periwinkle. I kind of got discovered in inverted commas there in the 1950s by pharmaceutical chemists. So obviously it had been known about and discovered long ago in Madagascar, but then we became aware of it in the West in the 50s and learnt about things like vincristine and vinblastine, which are these anti-cancer agents which basically are part of chemotherapy. So this plant is the origin of what we use for chemotherapy to treat cancers. So it's used on things like leukemia and lymphoma, and it really works. So we're looking at patients who had a 10% survival chance going up to 95% survival using vincristine, which originates from the Rosy Periwinkle. So that demonstrates just how important these sorts of plants are and these sorts of discoveries are, and how valuable similar discoveries could be in the future. And we'll kind of look at how those discoveries are being put at risk through processes like deforestation, which are damaging the habitats of plants like this, which we may not yet have discovered all of the uses of. And so they have a range of uses, so things like against bladder cancers, a range of other cancers. So we want to know what cancers they're useful against, and these figures about how useful it is are really handy for evaluating in an exam as well, so being able to make reference to this 10% to 95% figure. So there's about a half-page section on page 360 in the textbook about the Rosy Periwinkle. So you want some notes about the Rosy Periwinkle from these different headings. You can do a little bit of additional research if you'd like, and it's you can be asked to compare the effectiveness of natural plants and medicines against modern medicine in the exam. That's kind of a common question that you might look at, so it's good to have a solid understanding of an example of natural medicine. Okay, so the next section is about sorts of conservation issues around usage of natural plants. So many natural medicines are sourced directly from wild populations. So there's a couple that aren't, so things like Rosy Periwinkles and foxgloves are actually grown specifically as medicines, but many are just people go out into the rainforest or into nature and they collect the plants directly from nature. So this is obviously has real negatives, that the plants are growing at their natural rate and then people are going into the forests and collecting them, and if they're worth quite a lot of money, they might be collecting them at an unsustainable rate for the growth of the plant. And then we've got lots of pharmaceutical companies which work very hard to what's called synthesize drugs, so make them in a lab. Now this is beneficial for nature in the sense that no longer are the plants being collected from the rainforest or what have you, and therefore there's less damage being done to the rainforest. But the downside is that those people who live often in the developing world who've been collecting and selling these plants, now there's no longer a market for their plants because the people can get them from the pharmaceutical companies from the lab, and often the pharmaceutical companies won't then provide any kind of financial payment to those countries, so it's not very fair. So these traditional medicines and Chinese traditional medicines often harvested from wild plants, and it's quite common, particularly with the Chinese medicines, that there's a need to use the root of the plant, and this is particularly problematic because, as you can imagine, if you remove the root of the plant, then that pretty much kills the plant, whereas if you were able to use, say, the flowers or the leaves, this would allow the plant to carry on and grow and carry on for coming years. So there's an increased risk of driving the plants to extinction. And this is quite significant in terms of the amount of people using it, because the majority of the developing world talking about 5 billion people, are relying on these traditional medicines. So whilst we in the UK possibly don't see traditional medicines as a significant product, a thing that many people use, but actually on a global scale, many people do use traditional medicines, and it's their main source of medicine. So there's a huge demand for these sorts of products. And we can see that in other examples. So quite a few of the animals that are endangered in the world, it's because parts of them are used in traditional medicine. And so therefore there's a massive demand, particularly because the population in developing countries is increasing so rapidly. So whereas maybe previously China had a much smaller population, now it's well over 1 billion. So there's a much greater demand for things like traditional medicines. So normally we would look at this as a card sort. You'd have sort of some cards looking at the positives and negatives of wild harvesting versus cultivation for species and ecosystems. That's not really possible while you're at home, but here are the positives and negatives for wild harvesting on the left and cultivation on the right. And what we're going to do then is just take this information and write a bit of a paragraph to evaluate wild harvesting versus cultivation. So to cultivate is to grow on like a farm, for example, whereas wild harvesting is going into nature and taking the plants from there. So you can pause on this slide and write the paragraph using this information that we've got here, okay? So we've got a few useful figures. These are just to help with regards to any kind of essay evaluating the significance of use of wild medicinal plants on nature. So we've got things here that in China, close to 5,000 of the 26,000 native species are used for medicinal purposes, so a huge number of their crops. And 25% of drugs in advanced countries are derived from wild plant species. So we're very reliant on the natural medicines for all sorts of drugs that we use, play a really big part in our modern medicine. So largely because of growing population, we now see massive overharvesting of plants. This has an impact on things like genetic diversity, which affects how secure plants are from pests and predators. So you want a wider genetic diversity to stay safe from kind of pests that might attack the plants. We've got quite a few plants at risk of extinction because of the overharvesting. So we've got here as many as 4,000 medicinal plants are threatened and 14 are acutely endangered. And a lot of these plants rely on very specialised niches, so very specific locations that they grow. And this makes them a lot more vulnerable to becoming extinct. Not just because people are harvesting them, but also because we as humans are affecting their natural habitats as well. So not only are we collecting these plants to use for medicines, but we're also, say, destroying the rainforest and things like this, which is where a lot of these plants come from. So habitat destruction is a major issue. So 70% of plants are found in the rainforest, and there's going to be a huge number of medicinal plants that are found in the rainforest that we have yet to discover. So only 1% of these plants have been tested for medicinal use, and of those, that's where we've gotten all of our traditional medicines from and a lot of our modern medicines. And so it's logical to assume that many of the other plants that are yet untested could also provide a lot of solutions to the sorts of illnesses that we have, and we haven't yet tested them, and yet we might destroy those plants just through things like logging and other practices that we do in the tropical rainforest. So we've got a little figure here about how much deforestation is occurring every day. Again, so something you can use to kind of emphasise the significance of this point. So there's this estimate that one potential drug is lost every 2 years due to tropical deforestation. Quite where that figure comes from, I'm not sure, but it's something, again, that make reference to. It is cited in the textbook, so fair enough, but it seems like a bit of a tricky thing to maybe calculate. And then finally, we've got this thing about biopiracy. So this is kind of going back to what I was mentioning, that the pharmaceutical companies tend to go looking for plants that they can utilise. Then once they've found them, they work out how to create that same thing in a lab, and they don't give any money back to the country that they originally got it from. And this is sort of, at times, this can be seen as theft. Essentially, this is, you know, not a good practice, arguably, to kind of exploit these indigenous communities and then take what they have. So there are a range of options to try and protect the places that these plants come from. So we've got here about, we can try and protect a specific species. So if we're aware that there is a species in a location, then we protect that location to look after that species, or we can try and protect a whole ecosystem, and we can put in place rules that mean that pharmaceutical companies have to divert their profits back to locals as part of an agreement to keep protecting the forest. And this happens in places like Samoa and Costa Rica. So there's some guidance here on notes you need to take, which basically is just recapping what we've had a little look at in those slides. So this is on pages 360 and 361. So we're having a look at sort of the conservation issues around using plants. So there's a heading about conservation issues and medicinal plants. Looking then at the effects of deforestation, what is biopiracy, and then a bit of an idea about the strategies that can be used to reduce the impact, because you kind of in an exam you can talk about how the negatives and how nature is badly affected by use of these plants, and then you can kind of look at the other side and say, well, however, there are these projects which are there to protect nature, and such as in Samoa and Costa Rica.